grade 12s. I am Jessica Henning and I am a life sciences educator at Abbott's College in Cape Town. And what we're going to be doing today is some life sciences revision for paper 1. So first of all, let's start off by having a reminder of what are the topics that we need to concentrate on in paper 1. So we've got reproduction in vertebrates, human reproduction, responding to the environment humans, and that is our nervous system. Then we've got responding to the environment with plants, and the endocrine system and homeostasis. So what's important here is the responding to the environment and the endocrine and homeostasis sections, because as you can see, they count for a lot of the marks. And so those are the two topics that I'm going to be focusing specifically on today, as well as a little bit of general exam tips as well. So we'll focus on that, and we're going to start off with the nervous system. So first of all, our nervous system. What is the nervous system? Well, it is a system there to help us respond to changes in our external environment. So we have nerves running throughout our entire body. And what this does is it picks up on changes in the environment around us, and it allows us to react to those changes appropriately. And so this diagram is showing us something very, very important, which is the reflex arc. And reflex actions are so important to us because they are there to protect us from further harm. So in this case, if we look at the picture, what can we see? We've got a finger being held over the flame of a candle. And then on the right-hand side of the picture, we've got the spinal cord. And then finally, if we move to the left at the bottom of the picture, what we have is a muscle. And so we are going to describe this reflex action that is occurring. A reflex action is a rapid automatic response. So rapid, meaning it takes place quickly, so it's really, really fast. And then automatic, meaning we don't think about it. It just happens, which is amazing. And it's so important because, as I said, it is there to protect our bodies from harm. So what happens in this diagram is, let's talk through it. So we start off with the finger being held over the candle with the flame. And so we all know what's going to happen. Your finger's going to get burnt if you hold it there for too long. But now we've got our reflex actions which prevent that from happening. So what we are going to do is, inside our finger, we have little receptor cells. And those receptor cells pick up on changes in temperature. Those are the thermoreceptors. And they are going to pick up on the heat from the flame. We also have pain receptors in our finger, which are also going to pick up on the heat from the flame as well. So these receptors in our finger pick up on the stimulus. Stimulus is the change in our external environment. And in this case, the stimulus is the flame from the candle, the fire. So receptors in our finger pick up on a change in the stimulus, which is the flame. The receptors in our finger then take that information and they turn that information into a nerve impulse. That nerve impulse then gets sent from our finger all the way up along our arm and to our spinal cord. And this nerve impulse is transmitted along the sensory neurons. So going from X to point A in the diagram, those are the sensory neurons. And that is the information traveling from the receptors in your finger to the spinal cord. And so it enters through the dorsal root of the spinal cord, dorsal meaning at the back. And what happens then is this nerve impulse is transmitted from the sensory neurons that have entered the spinal cord across the synapse to the interneurons or connector neurons. And these are the neurons inside the spinal cord, inside the gray matter in the spinal cord. The interneurons carry that nerve impulse, and they take that information and they pass it across the synapse to the motor neurons. And the motor neurons carry that nerve impulse, transmit that nerve impulse out from the ventral root of ventral, meaning at the front of the spinal cord, and all the way down your arm to the effectors. And in this case, the effectors are the muscles in your arm. And the effectors are what is going to react. And that means you're then going to flex or relax or contract your muscles and move your hand away. And in this way, you have brought about a reflex action and you have protected yourself, your finger, from further harm. And so this happens extremely quickly, and the information is only transmitted to the spinal cord. Only a few seconds later will this information be transmitted to the brain. And only once the information reaches the brain will you realize, ow, my finger really, really hurts. But there's often a slight delay in that because you have already initiated this reflex action to protect yourself. And that has already occurred, and you've already moved your hand away before you even realize that you are hurt. So it's super amazing way that our body looks after us, and very, very important. So that is the reflex action. And there is another concept that we also need to know about, which is called the reflex arc. And now the reflex arc, that is the pathway of neurons, and neurons are our nerve cells, through which the reflex action travels in order to occur. So I've written this out nicely for us on the next slide, if we have a look here. And now this is a sort of standard answer that you could use for any question involving a reflex action. The only thing you would need to do is to change what the receptor is. So in this case, our receptor was the finger, and the stimulus might change. So in this case, it was the heat of the flame, but maybe your receptor would be your foot and you stood on a thorn. So the stimulus would be the thorn. So we can take this answer and modify it to fit any situation. So anytime you're asked to explain the reflex action, you can use this as a sort of basis for your explanation and modify it to the particular example that you have been given in the question. So in this case, our receptor, the finger, has received the stimulus of heat from the flame. The receptor converts this information into a nerve impulse. The sensory neurons carry that nerve impulse from the receptor in your finger all the way up your arm and to the spinal cord, where that information is passed to the interneuron or connector neuron. Those two words can be used interchangeably. The connector neuron in the spinal cord then transmits the impulse across the synapse to the motor neurons. And this impulse is then conducted from one neuron to the next across each synapse, all the way from your spinal cord to the effectors. And in this case, the effectors are the muscles in your arm and your hand. And it carries this message in the nerve impulse to say you need to contract and relax the relevant muscles in your hand and your arm in order to move your finger away. And in this way, you have managed to protect yourself from further harm, so from further burning your finger. So very cool that we're able to do this, which is super awesome. And then also, as I say, this is a nice way to explain it. It's very clear, and you can take this explanation and modify it. So the receptor, the stimulus, and the effectors will change depending on your particular example, but the process through which the nerve impulse travels is the same. So please remember this, and it's a really nice way that you can get 5 or 6 marks in an exam, which is awesome. Right, so we're carrying on still with the nervous system, but now we're going to talk about the eye. And the eye is one of our receptors that is part of the nervous system. and it's one of our sensory receptors, allowing us to pick up on information and changes in the world around us, in our external environment. And so we pick up on this information. We're looking at light and the amount of light that enters the eye, and we take that information, it gets sent through our nerves to our brain, where we process that into a picture that we actually see. All right, so let's have a look at some of the structures of the eye and then talk roughly about how the light enters the eye and then moves through the eye and to the brain. So at the front of our eye, we have our cornea, which is a very clear area that allows light to pass through. Just inside the cornea, there is a fluid called the aqueous humor. So when light enters the eye, it passes through the cornea, through this fluid called the aqueous humor. It then passes through your pupil, which is that black spot in the middle of your eye. And the pupil is not actually a structure. It's literally just an open hole that allows light to pass through it. And so the light passes through the pupil, and just inside the pupil, there is the lens. And the lens is the part of the eye that is so important, because what happens is the lens allows us to bend or refract the light in such a way that the light hits the retina at the back of the eye. And that is important because the retina is where the receptor cells are located. And so light, as we said, enters the eye, it moves through the cornea, through the aqueous humor, through the pupil, it hits the lens, which is a clear disc. The lens refracts or bends the light. The light then travels through the vitreous humor, which is the fluid inside the eyeball, and the light is focused at the back of the eye on the retina. And the retina has the receptor cells, which are going to pick up on the light entering the eye. And there are two different kinds of receptor cells. So there are rods and there are cones. And our rods are receptor cells that are able to see in black and white. And we have a lot of rods. And then cones are the receptor cells that allow us to see in color. And we've got cones that come in three colors, ones that pick up on red light, blue light, and yellow light. And we use that to pick up on the colors of the light entering our eye. Those receptor cells, those rods and cones located in the retina, take this information and turn it into a nerve impulse. That nerve impulse is then transmitted along the optic nerve to the brain, to the cerebrum in the brain, which is the main outer part of the brain, and specifically to the occipital lobe, which is located at the back of your head. And this is where that nerve impulse is transmitted into a picture. And we put that information together into what we actually see. So our eye is just a receptor for picking up on light, and it works together with our brain to make a picture of the world around us. So they often ask questions about the eye, so it's very important that you understand how to label a diagram of the eye and what the functions are of the different parts of the eye. And then they often like to ask questions about, there are two parts of how the eye works that they like to ask about. And those are either pupillary mechanism, which is how our pupil, the black spot in the middle of our eye, changes shape, changes size in order to allow different amounts of light to enter the eye. And the other one is what's called accommodation. And that is how the lens in our eye changes shape, depending on if we're looking at something close up to us or something far away in the distance. So let's have a look at this question. This is from a past paper, so it's quite a good example. So the bar graph below illustrates the curvature or roundness of the lens in the eye of a human while viewing 4 objects. So objects A to D at different distances from the eye. So this is a really nice question because it's also asking us to interpret information in a graph, which is a skill that we need to have and we need to know. So we need to be able to understand what the graph is showing us and how to read information off the graph. So our first question asks us, what is the curvature of the lens in arbitrary units when viewing object C? So if we have a look at the graph, the heading of the graph tells us that this is a graph showing the curvature of the lens when viewing objects at different distances from the eye. And then across the bottom, we've got the objects, and that is our independent variable, so objects A to D. And then on the y-axis, which is the vertical axis, we have the curvature or roundness of the lens. And so that is the dependent variable. That is what we're measuring in terms of how curved is the lens, depending on how far away the object is from our eye. So for the first question, they're asking us, what is the curvature of the lens when viewing object C? So we look at the bar for object C, and we can see that it goes up to 40 curvature units. And that is our answer for that question, which is really awesome. Next, they ask us to use the information in the graph to explain the changes that will occur if a person wanted to get a clear image of object D a few seconds after looking at object A. So what they're actually asking us is to describe how the curvature of the lens is changing from when we look at object D to looking at object A. So that is a question about accommodation. So it's actually asking us about accommodation, which is really helpful once we know what the question is asking us, because then we can focus in on our answer. So let's have a look at how we would answer a question about accommodation. So in this case, we want to go from looking at something at object A, where the lens is the most curved because it's at just less than 120, to looking at an object at D, which is just over 20. So we're going from very high curvature of the lens to much lower curvature of the lens. So we can tell that already from looking at the graph. So let's explain what's happening here. So if we have a look at the eye, we know from the question, from looking at the graph, that object D is further away than object A, and the lens is becoming less curved as we move from looking at object A to looking at object D. And so the curvature of the lens is controlled by two parts of the eye. There are the ciliary muscles and the suspensory ligaments. So the ciliary muscles are connected to part of the eye. Then the suspensory ligaments join to the ciliary muscles and then connect onto that lens, that clear disc that bends or refracts light to enter the right part of the eye. So what happens when we go to looking at something far away from looking at something close? And when I say close, I mean closer than 6 meters. And far away is further away than 6 meters. And so what we see happening is that the ciliary muscles are going to contract, the ciliary muscles relax, pulling the suspensory ligaments tight, which then pulls on that lens, pulling the lens flatter. And so the tension on the lens increases and the lens becomes flatter or less convex. This means that the light rays that enter the eye are bent or refracted much less and are therefore appropriately focused on the right place in the retina, allowing us those receptor cells to pick up on that information. So if we have a look at the diagrams at the bottom, that is showing how we move from near vision, closer than 6 meters, to the distance vision. And that is what our eyes are doing when we move from looking at object A, which would be the picture on the left-hand side, to object D, which is the picture on the right-hand side. So our ciliary muscles are going to relax, the suspensory ligaments are going to become tight, and the tension on the lens is going to increase, pulling flatter. The light rays are then refracted or bent less, and the light rays will focus on the retina. Now, you can also take this answer and change it around if we're talking about moving from something, looking at something far away to looking at something close up. So then we'll move instead from the picture on the right to the picture on the left. And so what we're going to see happen then, if we're going to looking at something close, our ciliary muscles are going to contract. Those suspensory ligaments are going to become loose or slacken, and there will be less tension on the lens, allowing that lens to curve further, allowing those light rays to be refracted or bent more, and that light will then focus on the retina. So that is how we explain accommodation, which is what allows us to see something up close versus something far away. And so, very important part of how the eye functions. Please note that accommodation is not to be confused with pupillary mechanism. So accommodation is to do with changes in the curvature of the lens, depending on if we're looking at something close up to us or something far away. Pupillary mechanism involves different parts of the eye, different structures in the eye, and has to do with how much light is able to actually enter the eye. So please be very careful when looking at the questions and understand, are they asking me about accommodation or are they asking about pupillary mechanism? So that you give the correct answer to the question. You're actually answering what they are asking for. Right, so that's the nervous system. You also need to know about the ear and hearing and how the ear is involved in balance. So very important to have a look at that section as well. All right, moving on now to something a little bit different. Let's talk about the endocrine system and homeostasis. So the endocrine system, these are our hormones. And hormones are another way in which our body responds to changes in the environment. Hormones are little chemicals that carry messages around our body, and these hormones carry their messages through the bloodstream, so through our blood and our circulatory system. And what we use these hormones for are to carry messages to facilitate various actions happening within our body. So in this case, let's have a look at what the main endocrine glands are. So the main ones are the pituitary gland located in our brain. And the pituitary gland is responsible for secreting many hormones. So we've got follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which are very important in the development of our sexual reproductive hormones. Also important is ADH, which is called antidiuretic hormone, which is involved in maintaining the balance of water within our body. Then we've got the thyroid gland located at the front of our neck here, which produces thyroxine, which controls our metabolic rate. The adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys, and they produce adrenaline as well as aldosterone, two very important hormones. Our pancreas secretes insulin and glucagon, which are involved in controlling our blood sugar levels. And then finally, in females, biological females, we have ovaries, which produce estrogen and progesterone, the female sexual hormones. And in males, we have the testes, which produce testosterone, the male sexual hormones. So we use these hormones to bring about what's called homeostasis. And our homeostasis is this idea of maintaining a constant internal environment. So homeostasis, as I said, is about maintaining a constant internal environment. We want to keep things in our body balanced. We don't want too much of something and we don't want too little of something. And so what we do is we change how much of particular hormones we secrete or release throughout our body in order to bring about changes to maintain this balance or equilibrium within our body. And we do this by using what's called negative feedback. So this is where one hormone will act on another part of the body to inhibit or stop something from happening, or to promote something happening in order for things to return back to normal. So this is a really nice template answer that you can use and apply to any situation. So anytime they're asking you about homeostasis or negative feedback, you can follow these 8 steps. And if you kind of write down something for each of these points, you will have covered the whole process that takes place. So let's look at how we're going to use this. So let's look at an example question. So we've got a diagram which represents one part of the negative response. So that's a negative feedback system that occurs when a person is dehydrated. So dehydrated, you're lacking in water, you're going to feel thirsty. And the decrease in blood volume that occurs because we've got less water. All right, so we need to know some important information. First, we need to know what is the hormone. So what is the chemical messenger that is involved in this process? So we were told it's to do with dehydration. And so if we are looking at the amount of water in our body, in our blood, we are going to be dealing with the hormone called ADH, which is short for antidiuretic hormone. The hormone is secreted by the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland located in the brain into our bloodstream, where it travels through our circulatory system, throughout our body, down to our target organ. And the target organ is, where is this hormone carrying its message to? And in this case, our target organ is the kidneys. And this then brings about a particular response. So it makes something happen. So we've already identified the hormone as ADH. The endocrine gland that secretes the hormone is the hypothalamus in the brain together with the pituitary gland. And this then carries this message to the target organ, which is the kidneys. So let's describe this negative feedback response that occurs when a person is dehydrated. So our brain, the receptors located in the hypothalamus in the brain, are going to pick up on the fact that there is less water in the blood. The hypothalamus is then going to send a message to the pituitary gland to tell the pituitary gland to secrete more ADH, more antidiuretic hormone. More antidiuretic hormone is going to be released into our bloodstream. That antidiuretic hormone is going to travel down to the kidneys. And once it gets to the kidneys, ADH is going to drop off its message to the kidneys, and it's going to tell the tubules in the kidneys that they need to become more permeable. And what permeable means is it allows certain molecules to be able to pass through it. So a membrane can be permeable, allowing certain molecules to pass through it. So more antidiuretic hormone makes the walls of the kidney tubules more permeable, meaning more water can pass out of the kidney tubules and be reabsorbed back into our bloodstream. This then increases our blood volume, the water in our blood, back to normal. So it's brought about a response, raising the amount of water in our blood back to normal. And the effectors in this case were the kidneys and the tubules in the kidneys. In this way, we are going to basically hold on to that water within our body instead of urinating it out. Therefore, our urine is going to be a lot more concentrated and there's going to be a lot less of it. And this is important because we are dehydrated, we're lacking water, we're thirsty. We want to try to keep as much water in our body as possible. So, more ADH, kidney tubules become more permeable, more water is reabsorbed, and we return back to a normal volume of water in the blood. So this is how we maintain homeostasis, this constant internal environment. So as I said, just to go back here, we've described this negative feedback that has taken place. So you can use this as a template to help you answer any negative feedback question involving any of the hormones, whether it's thyroid stimulating hormone, aldosterone, testosterone, follicle stimulating hormone, whatever the case may be. You can use this information to help you formulate your answer for that. All right, just a couple of last exam tips to end off with. So these are just really general exam tips. So it's super important that you know how to interpret a graph as well as you know how to draw a graph. You could be asked to draw a bar chart, a pie chart, a line graph, or a histogram. And so it's a really nice place to get marks because a graph is worth 6 or 7 marks depending on the particular question. And you can get those marks pretty easily if you know how to go about drawing a graph. So I've given you an example here that I gave my own students in my class in their mock exams that we just completed. And so what we've got here is a frequency tree showing tongue rolling. So that's a genetic trait. Can you roll your tongue or can you not? Give it a try and see if you can. I can't, so I'm in the 200 that cannot roll their tongue. So what I did was I asked them then to draw a bar chart of this information. So your graph always needs to have a heading. So very, very important to have a heading, and that heading needs to include the independent variable and the dependent variable. So the independent variable is the thing that I change. So in this case, what am I changing? I'm changing whether the person can roll their tongue or can't. And the dependent variable is the outcome that is measured. So what I did was I went and I asked 1,000 students, can you do this or can't you? And they responded. So that is going to be our dependent variable. So very important that we mention both the number of individuals and the characteristic of tongue rolling, which are our two variables, in our heading. Then we draw a set of axes. On the x-axis, which is our horizontal axis, we always put our independent variable, which in this case is the characteristic of tongue rolling. Then on our y-axis, we put our dependent variable, which is the number of individuals. And so we're showing the number of students that can or can't do these things. So we've already got 3 marks if we've done that correctly. We've given a heading, we've given an appropriate heading for the x-axis, and an appropriate scale. Same for the y-axis, a heading and scale. Then you get a mark for drawing the correct type of graph. In this case, they were asked to draw a bar chart. Please note, in a bar chart, there is always a space between the bars. And it's very important that that space is there. Otherwise, what you've drawn is not a bar chart. And then finally, you get 2 marks for plotting your actual information. So this is where you took the 800 learners and you drew your column or your bar on your graph to show that 800 individuals could do that. And then you took your 200 and you drew that as a bar on your graph. And there you go. You've scored 6 marks, which is pretty awesome. So please do keep that in mind and practice drawing the different types of graphs. Finally, please use your reading time effectively. make sure you understand what these questions are actually asking. So sometimes I get the most beautifully written answers in an exam, but unfortunately is not answering what I've asked. So please take your time to understand what the question is really asking you for. Also, time is short, so don't get stuck on a particular question. If you don't know, leave it out and move on, and you can come back to it later once you've answered the questions that you do know how to answer. So don't waste time, carry on, and then when you've got time left at the end, come back and focus on those questions that you weren't sure of. Please be really specific when answering the questions. So, for example, if the examiner asked you about tortoises, tell them about tortoises. Don't now start talking about turtles or gorillas or something else. Talk about the tortoises. Make it specific to what you were asked. Be able to label diagrams, very important. Also, often they like to ask questions around give the number and the name of a particular part on a diagram. So please, if they say that, please do give the number and the name. It's so important. Often people just give one piece of information. Please also be guided by the marks allocations. 1 mark means 1 fact, 1 piece of information. So keep that in mind. Bring the correct stationery with you. You need a pen, pencil, a ruler, a calculator, a compass, and a protractor for life sciences. So very important, make sure you have all of that with you. Write neatly. It is in your benefit to write neatly so that whoever is marking your paper at the end of the year can read it and understand what you're trying to say. If they can't read it, they don't know what's going on and they're going to mark you wrong. So, and we don't want that to happen. So please take your time to write neatly. Finally, take a deep breath, keep calm, and good luck for the exam. So thank you very much for following along with this lesson on paper 1. Go out there and study hard. And as I said, I wish you the very best of luck for the upcoming exams and go well.